name's Morgan Young, and I'm interviewing Bruce Hanna and Arnie Roblan for the Oregon State Capitol Foundation Oral History Project. It is June 18th, 2024, and we are in Roseburg, Oregon. Thank you both for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah, should be fun.
Yep.
It's going to be fun. I want each of you to tell me a bit about what your lives were like before you became elected officials. As far back as you want to go. Childhood,
You wanna
education,
go?
career?
I'll go. I go.
Okay.
Born in Port Angeles, Washington in 1948, so it's been a number of years since then. And I went to school in Port Angeles, then I went to a community college. It was Peninsula Community College, and then to the University of Washington. When I graduated, I followed my high school principal, who had become the assistant superintendent in Coos Bay, Oregon. And I came to Coos Bay, Oregon to be a math teacher. I did that for about 10 or 11 years, and then I became the dean of students, did that for a few years. Then I became the assistant principal curriculum. I did that for a few years, and then I ended up being the principal for the last 12 or 13 years until 2004 or 5, and then graduated to the legislature. Right after, actually in my final year at the high school, I was campaigning for the legislature.
Well, I was born right here in Roseburg, Oregon, so I haven't gone far. Raised down the road in Myrtle Creek, Oregon, attended grade school through high school in the South Umpqua School District. Somewhat interesting, I'm the youngest of 7 children, and I have all older sisters, so somewhat unique that way. I attended Umpqua Community College right here in Roseburg, and then on to what was then Northwest Christian College. I've been in business basically my whole adult life. Started out as a Dairy Queen owner-operator, left that, moved to Atlanta, Georgia for some training with the Coca-Cola company, came back and worked with my parents in the Coca-Cola business, left there for some time, went to Southern Oregon where I bought a 7-Up and RC Cola franchise. I spent about 7 years down there. Came back to Roseburg when my parents were ready to retire in late 1989 and 1990, purchased the Coca-Cola business here. Became active in all kinds of community things and got interested in the legislature talking about workers' comp reform. And literally went and testified before the legislature about workers' comp related issues. And one day while I was there explaining unit, stat, date, and other variable things about workers' comp, I realized the people I were talking to didn't understand what I did about workers' comp. And I came home and told Teresa that I was going to join the legislature. And she said, well, honey, I think you have to get elected. But literally, I was that naive to begin with, but that's how I got there. And as it turns out, the person who represented the district immediately before me left, and I got appointed for a very short time period in 2004 and then elected in the next cycle.
So you both were elected the same year.
We were elected the same year, though he had more seniority because he got appointed ahead of time.
I had a few months, literally. I mean, a few months of being appointed, but.
So talk me through what it's like being a freshman in the legislature.
Well, I think we had different experiences. I was in the minority, which has been rare since then.
Mm-hmm.
But being in the minority, you don't have as many opportunities to get the bills you want through. So you have to start deciding whether you want to make friends and work with people. And I got put on 2 really good committees for me. One was education, which had been my whole life, and the other was agriculture, since there was nobody in the Democratic caucus that knew what agriculture was. Well, there were a few of us. There aren't very many from the rural parts of the state. So they put me on agriculture, and I had an amazing chair who let me do a whole lot of stuff in the agriculture committee, and it was really, really nice to have an opportunity. So we went through, and I decided I had a lot of free time, so I started a tradition that I kept the whole time I was there. Every Friday I would go around and take little chocolate mints to give to every staff member in the House. Not to the staff, not to the legislators, but to their staff, and just say hi to everybody. And then, because it got started and everybody liked it, every year after that, when I got into the majority, I still ended up taking chocolate around. And even when we were speaker on Fridays, I would go and take chocolate around to people. Then I went over to the Senate, so then I had to do the whole building. It kicked a lot more time, but you got to know all the ins and outs of a whole lot of different parts of the Capitol that I don't think the rest of the people knew. So it was helpful for me.
I think, besides Arnie's kindness in that part, and I think you got to know so many people in the building, which was
That's true.
a huge advantage. But I think when you get there as a freshman, for me, I had requested Ways and Means assignments as committees, and the speaker at the time sort of laughed at me and said, you're probably not going to get Ways and Means assignments. And I said, well, I'd really like to, and that's kind of where my head is at, is in, finance and budget and so on and so forth. And I had probably, 24 to more people call that speaker then and say, hey, this guy's pretty good at this stuff. You might want to consider it. And so I did get Ways and Means assignments. I really enjoyed that time. But I think, what Arnie said that's so important is I got there in the majority. So we've both had that experience of serving majority, minority, and they are vastly different. And so in my freshman cycle, I had subcommittees in Ways and Means, and finally 2 full Ways and Means, and it was busy and really going. So our experiences were somewhat different in that beginning cycle, just because of who was running the show at the time, and that all changed drastically.
We did all buy a flag. There was a courtyard, which is now under construction, where we had all 50 states' flags, and there was one flag left. So one of our freshman members decided, let's all get together and buy Hawaii. So we bought the Hawaiian flag, and we had pictures of us all out there standing by the flag, which was kind of fun, because you go back and look at all the different people who were in that picture. Eventually, most of them were in leadership at one time.
Yep, for sure, yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your respective districts and what there were some issues facing your constituency at the time when you were first elected?
Oh, I think our districts are relatively similar. I mean, of course, they're not the same districts anymore because the boundaries have changed somewhat significantly. But, the rural district I was representing then was District 7, very agricultural, natural resource oriented, no real city per se. I mean, the north edge of Roseburg, Sutherland, Cresswell, out past Pleasant Hill to Lowell and clear up Highway 58. So a lot of very rural area, most of it natural resource driven. Everything from land use to permitting, those are big issues in those kind of areas. And I would tell you that even in today's legislative process, most rural legislators and their constituents think they don't get representation on their issues. And some of it's true, just because the population of Oregon is centered in one area for the most part. And some of it is perceived just because you are very rural and the issues are somewhat different.
Yeah, and mine is very similar. I think we are a little poorer. We had the failure of the fishing industry and the failure of the timber industry. So what was at one time 16 or 17 mills on the bay was down to 2 or 3. And the fishing boats got bought up by the federal government, so they got at least a little bit when they lost a lot of the fishing. So a lot of poverty. I agree that most of them don't feel like they're represented. It was, when I got in the majority, it was the first time they had that for a while, so that makes a difference with respect to getting things for the community. But as an educator, I knew most of the people. It was a real advantage for me, and I knew what families they came from and the kinds of problems they'd have. There is still, and it still exists today, a lot of I wouldn't say institutional. A lot of family money in our area. You don't know who you're talking to sometimes if you're not careful. You may be talking to the wealthiest person in the area, and you would never know it by seeing how they dressed or what they did. There's a great story about our swimming pool. We have an outdoor swimming pool, which is the high school swims, and everybody, they think it's funny because the deck gets frozen and all this other stuff. But it was falling in disrepair, and they had this little lady that used to live near it, and she called the coach and says, "So what do you need for your swim pool?" And she wrote him a check for $2,000 for this, $2,000 for that, and she finally said, So what would it take to fix the pool the way you want it? So they got an architect, $478,000. So the next time they went to lunch, she took a checkbook out and wrote a check for $478,000.
Goodness
And they
sakes.
said, "Oh,
Yeah.
really?"
Yeah.
And now we have a very large scholarship in her name and her family's name that gives 4-year scholarships of $16,000 a year to a senior that graduates from school. So there are amazing people in our area who have done an awful lot of different kinds of things, and it makes a difference. So people want to give back. We've had some really outstanding athletes, which has helped us. Mel Counts, who was one of the big 7-footers, now lives up in Oregon, was good there, and Steve Prefontaine that everybody knows. But there's also a kid that was the hammer throw champion from 1921 to 1932 in 3 Olympics, who is also a Marshfield kid. So it's kind of like all these interesting Marshfield people. So that was one of the things I found when I got to the legislature. A whole bunch of people I knew there who were old Marshfield kids, who were in the lobby, who were actually the legislators, and it was helpful for me.
Thinking back to perhaps when you were freshman representatives, did you have such a thing as a regular schedule?
You had more one than I did.
You know, as I say, that cycle, I literally had subcommittees in Ways and Means and full Ways and Means. So my days were full. I mean, and that means you were seeing constituents or taking constituent calls when you weren't in a committee meeting, but committee meetings took up the vast majority of your day. And on top of that, when you got into the waning days of the legislative session, Ways and Means was one of those committees and rules that just never stops. So while as a freshman, in some cases, you might have got towards the end of the session and you were literally somewhat waiting for the floor session to happen so that you were engaged at that moment. If you were on full Ways and Means, you were still meeting every day because every budget item was coming and everything with a fiscal was coming, and so it stayed pretty busy. I think the thing again, and I say this about rural legislators, when you're in Salem, you're hoping to be busy because that's why you're there. I mean, otherwise, it's not like that's where your social network is or that's where your family is. So you're there to work. So you're happy when things are busy and you've got a lot to be doing. It's, I found ways to stay busy. I went out to the State Police Training Center and trained with the state police at different times. I went and shot with them. I found ways to do social things, but in my freshman cycle, I was very busy. And the very next cycle, I became a junior leader of the caucus, and then one day the leader of the caucus left, and I was the leader of the caucus. So things happened very quickly after that.
And for me, the first year, I had 2 committees, and they met 2 or 3 times a week. So that was the only part of the schedule that was really set. That's why I got into the getting around and talk to everybody, figure out what was going on in the rest of the building. It also meant that, and since it's 3.5 hours home, you don't go home during the week. You go home on the weekends.
Yeah.
And so you have all this extra time, so you get to know people a little bit, know what's going on in Salem. But you work at keeping busy and finding out what you would be helpful to know. I signed up and was a whip my freshman year. They let me be one of the whips, and so that meant that they wanted, you always had to go count votes to find out whether or not, how people or what we're going to vote on the next day. There was a funny story one time. Because I was the whip, I had to interact with the leadership in the House. Sometimes they would tell you, sometimes they wouldn't. But if they needed your vote, they would tell you, because they would get you to figure out where the votes were. But there was one time I was sitting next to, it was Mr. Boquist, who was in the House at the time. And we were talking, and he was getting all ready for his bill. And I said, "Oh, they're not doing your bill today." He says, "Oh, of course they are." I said, "I was just talking to your leader. They're not doing your bill today." And he gets up, goes over, and comes back and says, "I'm not talking to them anymore. I'll just talk to you." But it's that kind of thing that, you force yourself to get into leadership or do some stuff. You get to know a little bit more about what's going on in the day-to-day stuff, which was really important for me. In education, it's always trying to learn stuff. And we had a really great clerk who was more than happy to help you. she would also let you know that, oh yes, you can call this particular thing, but if you don't tell your leadership before you do that kind of stuff, you could find yourself in a world of hurt. So if you take the time to go and talk with people who've been there for a while, all of a sudden you start learning a whole lot more about the process and gets you ready for the future.
And Oregon has a citizen legislature, which is different from other states. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that means?
I think of the citizen legislature as just interested people from the districts who find themselves, for the most part, and I'll use my own example. I got there because I had a specific interest to go, let me go see if I can adjust this from a statewide perspective, because it really mattered. And as you know, Oregon has SAFE, SAIF, and there was a lot of reform done. And actually, Oregon has done very well in the workers' comp world. And I think that's because enough business people brought the idea that, look, we got to really work at safety to make this work, but there should be some incentives back. And I think most, in terms of citizen legislators, and I'm going to say this about Arnie,
Sure.
I think he brought the expertise of education, so you focus there. And whether you came from the petroleum industry as a gas station owner operator, or you came from the restaurant industry, you probably had a specific idea to begin with that got you interested. And I use this all the time. I got to the legislature, I thought eyes wide open. And when I left, it was somewhere out here, because the breadth of information and topics that you begin to learn about and understand, it really expands your knowledge, not only of state government, but of people and industry in Oregon.
So the other part about it is about a third of the legislature are retired, like I was. The other 2/3 have a job. And they have to have a job to support their families, because what the legislature pays, even though a lot of people think it's a lot of money, has never been very much money. And I think the last time we increased the minimum wage, they had to give us a raise. So, I mean, it's kind of like low-level amount of money. And so if you didn't have some other income, you were in real trouble. So private business people who had people who they could trust that could run the business could do it, and retired police officers. And again, they each bring their own expertise to the deal. None of them are professional politicians. That's not what we do. And the tenure for most legislators is like 2 or 3 terms, because they can't afford to do it much longer. It was really hard to have women in the legislature, because they were raising families, and even if sometimes the husband would take over that task, but you really have to arrange your life as a citizen legislature to take advantage of the little bit they're going to give you, and then the grace of your employer, and then the ability to have a spouse or someone else that could help manage some of the stuff at home since you're not there. If you live in the Portland area, you can get to and from work each day, so you can get home. If you live outside in these rural areas, I mean, if you live in John Day, that's not an easy trip back and forth.
Well, you're needing to pay for housing, right?
And you need to
There's
pay
an
for housing.
economic
Yeah,
They
you
give us a little bit of money during the session to pay for housing, and if you find an inexpensive enough place, you can.
Yeah.
A lot of people brought their mobile homes, and other people bunked with other people, so they had 2 or 3 in a room. But you can make that happen with the little bit of money that they give you. That was my wife's only suggestion. Let's not make this cost us a lot of money. Let's
Yeah.
just,
I think because you have because Oregon does have a citizen legislature, I don't know exactly what the turnover rate is, but
Right.
I mean, for people like us, we could walk in the door today and not know anybody.
That's-
I mean, and that has exception. I think we
Right.
know 3 or 4 people, but
Yeah.
the turnover rate is relatively high because, as Arnie says, you're just not going to make that a career. It's not an economic career possibility. You might do it if you were retired for some long time period. And there are examples, Peter Courtney is one
That's true.
who worked for a university and was able to then also be a legislator, but he also lived right there, so he didn't have a commute, or he wasn't ever away from home. So I think it's very different. But for rural folks, whether you were from Hood River or Pendleton, LeGrand, Baker City, anywhere in southeastern Oregon or southeastern or southwestern coast, you're going there and staying there. And that's a much different experience than if you're driving, 45 miles from Portland, or 50, depending on
Right.
your district, so.
Yeah.
Did the majority minority switch before you all became speakers of the House?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about that and what that.
Actually, quite a few years before.
Yeah.
So it was like 3 terms, I guess, before we came. It was my 4th term and your 4th term that we became co-speakers. So we had 3 terms without it. So the first term, Karen Minnis is the speaker and I'm in the minority. The next term, Myrtle becomes the speaker of the House. And then he runs
And
for
we're in the minority.
And they're in the minority. And then the next term, Myrtle goes to DC and Hunt takes over the session before the 2 of us take this term. So there were 4 different speakers in the 4 terms that we were there.
Yeah, which is sort of unusual.
Yeah.
I mean,
It was.
like as I mentioned, Senate President Courtney, he was there for, I'm not sure how many years.
Longest ever, but yeah.
Longest ever serving Senate President. But in the House, that has not been the case. I mean, typically that Speaker's office turns over, again, I think just because of the progression of citizen legislature process, and uniquely, again, you had Republican majority
Right.
our first cycle, then it went Democrat, Democrat,
Democrat.
tie. So, when I say we've both experienced it, I've experienced a lot more in the minority.
Yes, I was in the majority most of the time I was
Yeah.
there, except for a tie and 1 minority.
Yeah.
visit.
So that's obviously impacting your committee appointments.
Correct.
Absolutely.
They do the speaker gets to decide where you go, so it makes a difference who's in charge. And a lot of times, people with the most expertise in the opposite party don't get in the play where their most expertise is. Sometimes they do. I mean, I think in large part, people like to use their expertise, and as a committee chair, they would often ask me, who would you like to have with the Republicans? Which I had some rules. I was ag chair right afterwards, so I said, the person who was the ag chair before, she needs to be my assistant chair. So she did, which was really nice, because it kept some continuity, and we figured out how to make things work together.
I would also say with some exception, because I'm an example of that. I mean,
You stayed on Ways.
I stayed in Ways and Means,
That's
and I
good.
stayed in Ways and Means, I feel like, because one, I had experience and some expertise, because that experience starts to add up and people start to come to those with experience. And I also think, and this probably helped as Arnie and I progressed to the place we did, that I was able to express opinion and differences in a way that wasn't offensive. It's just, let me explain to you why I have a difference of opinion about this, that, or the other thing, and not to be offensive about it. That's why I say, with exception, the Speaker's office gets to control where people are going to get assigned. And so if you could be there and be a professional and polite representation, you probably got to that seat again.
Exactly.
If you were the thorn in the side and never polite or professional about the method you represented it, you may not have. And I think that probably
I think that was true with
pretty true
everybody.
of
Yeah.
everybody. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
The big difference when that majority-minority is you have control over the docket, what's happening in your committee. So everybody writes bills, but not every bill gets heard. So every bill gets assigned to a committee, but not every bill that's assigned to a committee gets heard in a committee. So there's all of those decisions that get made that impact the rest of how you work and what you're doing together.
And is it at the same time that you're becoming a leader in your caucus?
yes, in the second cycle I was there, I was a deputy Republican leader. And we had, again, gone from majority to minority, and that was for anybody who came back who had been there prior to the cycle Arnie and I were freshmen, shocking. And I mean literally shocking. It's a monumental change when you've been there in the majority, and the next day you walk into session, you're no longer in charge. It's a shocking change. And we had quite a little bit of leadership change because former speaker, Karen Minnis, came back, but not as part of leadership in the caucus. Another person had ridden to a leadership position then. And so there was a little turmoil. I would say more than a little turmoil, and the caucus doesn't know quite how to respond, and the leadership kind of spun a little bit. And about 2/3 of the way through the cycle, the leader then just decided not to be the leader. And I literally was kind of sitting at the caucus table as one of the deputies, and I just said, hey, we can't all go home. We have to sit here and get work done. And we had some new caucus elections, and there it was. And so from that point on, I was in caucus leadership through the rest of my term in the legislature. And again, that changes your availability for committee assignments. It changes, the amount of time it takes. It changes everything during the election cycle, because now you're out raising money for everybody else, let alone yourself. It's a significant difference. Now, the benefit to it is you also participate with the other leaders from the other caucus. You're participating in all the budget meetings at the very highest level. You're there when the governor's there. You're there when the economic forecast is put out. You're there at the table. So you do have a significant level of involvement that's interesting and literally fun. But there's a lot of other work to do from the election cycle, and just simply, when you got that many people, there's always a personal issue and an employment issue, because remember, it's sort of a business. There's all these other employees and things, and a lot can happen.
Yep, and I was the whip, and I stayed the whip again the next term, and then in the Dave Hunt term, I became the Speaker Pro Tem. Which is mostly just one of the leadership people, but you don't have a lot of duties that other people have. But it helps you continue to get to know everybody in the caucus and work with people. And from my perspective, I have the ability to get along with my Republican friends a lot. So when Merkley was there, when we got towards the end, it was going and going and going. And Dave Hunt was our majority leader. And he and, who was your majority? Wayne did not get along well.
At all.
It was really bad. So Merkley calls me in the office and says, you talk to Wayne now. Go sit with Wayne and talk to him. We want to get out of this building. So I would sit, and he would go give me a list and say, we want to do these things this day and these things the other day. And so you could orchestrate a way to get out of the hearing, because the minority can cause you grief if they want. They have a lot of tools at their disposal, and when they are really upset with you, and I think you saw a lot of that last session, they can do things to disrupt. And so the deal was, could we figure out a way to make this so we didn't have to have such pain and suffering at the end?
And we were in the middle of the longest legislative cycle in history. I mean, we're clear into July and first week of August. I mean, we're going and going and going, and this turmoil at the top between these leaders
was not helping.
And we'll talk more about this when we get to this point, but we would do a call of the house on every bill. And I mean, a call of the house means they lock the doors, they go find every member, nobody can leave the building, it takes forever, and it's contentious. And I mean, it causes hard feelings, bitter feelings. People are angry because they can't even leave to go to the restroom. You're locking the doors to the place and saying, let's find everybody. And I think that started to form, because Arnie then got that, I'm going to call it side job, but literally that job that sort of skipped that current leader, and to get with Wayne. I'm on the sidelines at that point because I'm the deputy leader then at the time. So you're not thinking, hey, we're going to make this work. You're just looking and going, who's trying to make this happen, and who's trying to be reasonable and get through these things, and who's just stirring the pot. And I think we probably subliminally learned about
That's
one
right,
another a
exactly.
little bit during
I
that
agree.
time.
I
Because
agree.
you're watching
true.
going, why in the world are we doing this or this or this? And who's trying to smooth this out a little bit? So those were very formative times. you know.
We had one member who decided, yes, I'm going to vote, but not right now. For most of the day, people brought,
Most of the day and into the night. Yeah, just stayed on the floor, wouldn't leave,
And
wouldn't vote.
and you can't finish until he votes.
Yeah.
So people brought sleeping bags and laid on the floor. I mean, it got kind of crazy,
To say the least.
to say the least. They weren't nasty to each other, though. I mean, I will tell you, it was different than some of the stuff that's happened since then. People were, for the most part, respectful to most of us. There were a few that had a hard time with that, but
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to view it through the lens of today, either
Right.
at the state level or at the national level. Because I think when you're in the thick of it, it's hard to remember what it was like
Right.
before.
Yeah.
But when we're talking this time in the 2000s, before you become co-speakers of the House, is what's happening in Washington DC, in US Congress, or with the national caucuses, is that impacting your jobs as legislators at all?
I didn't think so at the time.
I wouldn't have thought so either. I wouldn't have thought that was much of an influence. You know, you knew members of Congress, you maybe invited them to an election party or they invited you to a fundraising event. But from the standpoint of just purely the political element of it, I would say not influenced
Right.
at all by that. Yeah.
That personalities influenced the most from my perspective. And we had the two leaders were from adjoining districts up in the Portland area, and they didn't do anything together. I mean, that was not a good situation.
Yeah.
And it had been not a good situation for a long time, so it didn't get better.
So let's talk about this tie that happens in 2010.
Yeah, I'll start there, because it was an amazing shock to us on the Democratic side. We lost 6 seats, so it wasn't a close call. Orchestrated him, for the most part, by Bruce and his team, figured out which ones to go after and how to get money to get them to be elected. I will tell you, I was sitting at home going through it, and I was thinking, wow, that's weird. This could be a tie. And pretty soon, it was a tie. And I don't think anybody, I know no one in the Democratic side could believe it actually happened. We thought we could lose a few seats, but 6 seats, no, wasn't going to happen. And there it was. And then everybody starts getting on the phone to try to figure out, what does this mean? What do we do? How does this work?
When the tie happened, you had 100 best friends because they all thought they were gonna tell you what should happen. But the ironic part probably about that election cycle is, by now I would say we are experienced legislators. We've been through enough election cycle to know what works and what doesn't work, and who's going to work hard, and who you want as part of that team. And Arnie and I were talking about our respective chief of staffs, as you know, what wonderful people they were, and they were obviously involved on the election side of things outside of the legislative process. But you know, I had in mind we got to go see if we can bring balance back, not knowing the difference between staying out of the super minority or super majority, which
Right.
again, that's a whole nother issue, is when you get down to the numbers where they only need you to show up to have enough numbers to vote versus you actually can sway things one way or the other. So I began to think, I think there's a way to get back so that we have balance again without being there. And we studied, and I mean, this group of people studied legislative districts, and we had 8 targeted districts and said, these are the places we could go, including one in Gresham that had like and I don't want to quote this wrong, somewhere between 8 and 12 points.
Democratic lead.
Democratic advantage. And I can literally remember the night of the election, I was in Portland, that's where all the media is, and that's where all these big parties about election day parties. And our first stop was at a lobbyist group party, and they asked me to, give my prediction, and I said, well, I think we're going to win these 6 seats. And they laughed, and I mean literally laughed at me, and I said, well, I've been out talking about balance and making Oregon great and having all these wonderful things, and I walked out of there with my tail between my legs a little bit. It's like, oh, that's hard to take. At the end of the election cycle, you're dog tired. You've been going nonstop. And as the evening wore on, it got closer and closer. Angela Wilhelms, who was then our political director and my chief of staff, says, did you bring a change of clothes? Because I think we're going to need to do some media. and Teresa, whom you've met today, said, yeah, I brought an extra set. And there we were, I can't remember what time it was, but trying to hit the news cycle to talk about, wow, this is really what happened. And it was remarkable to have your phone just ring nonstop with people thinking how you should handle all of this. And, that's maybe the best part of this whole story is how that finally came together. But the night itself was quite remarkable.
We were down a bit. They were up a whole lot.
Yeah.
And Bruce gets a lot of credit for that, for organizing the people to make it happen. It was surprising. And then everybody kept saying, what does this mean? What do we do with a tie? And the thing that first came to mention for the Democrats was, well, Courtney was in a tie. The only other tie that we've had in history was back in 2000 or whatever it was. The Senate had a tie 15-15. And so they had worked out a way of doing it. And so we went and looked at what he did. They did a sharing of different things. When we got together, nobody wanted to do that.
Yeah.
That was not a
that model wasn't going to fit. And remember, now we too still at our first meetings, we had leadership meetings, which I was in, Arnie was in, but it was still Dave. I mean,
right. Oh yeah, we had to have an election.
Yeah.
To see who was going to be our speaker candidate, and there were more than a few of us that put our names in to decide whether who was going to represent who, going into that after our caucus meeting that happened after that election, and so. I came out of that one, and Bruce. We all knew Bruce was going to win the one in that because he'd been the leader. He got him to there. There was no doubt about that. And from my perspective, we had to have a different choice than Dave, just because of the stuff that had gone on before. And so, how do we figure that out? And a number of people put their name in, and the caucus finally made a decision that I'd be the one.
I think this is important to say. If you're in that caucus and you weren't the then speaker in that leadership group and you put your name in the hat, that's a risk. And it is a significant risk because you're saying to your current leader, not you anymore, me now. And the courage it takes just to say I'm willing to put my name in the hat is a big deal. And the meetings we had prior to included the former speaker, included the people whose name were in the hat. And it also took from our side to say, hey, we're tied, and if you put your name in the hat, we're not voting for you. And these are people. This is not just like, saying it to a post in the ground. You're telling somebody, I don't have confidence in you anymore, and we're going to pick somebody else. And it's personally difficult. And I think that's the part people don't always understand is these are just people, and they're all sitting there, and their feelings get hurt, their pride gets hurt, and the people that are having to say it, it's like firing an employee a little bit, except you've been working with this person, in our case, for 3 cycles. I mean, we've been involved with them, we know them, and you're saying, not you now. And it is a tension-filled time.
If you get to know each of the 60 members in the House, everyone came there for the right reason. I don't know that I ever met a legislator who came there just because they wanted to get power, just because they wanted to do this. They wanted to do something for their community. They had an issue with respect to a law or whatever. They came there with intentions on making the state a better place. Every one of them.
Yeah.
And so it is a personal thing. When you go out and knock on doors and ask people for their vote, and then an election happens and you win, it is a personal thing. You put yourself on the line. Both the winner and the loser have put in the same kind of effort to get to the same place. And so every little thing that people say and otherwise do can affect you. And I will tell you that it affects the spouses more than it affects me, for one. I don't know
Yeah.
about that.
Oh, I'm certain it affects families. I mean, if you
Yeah.
had kids old enough to read the newspaper and they're keeping track of what dad or grandpa or whatever place you're in, and I always used to say this, and you're going to do political speeches, fundraising, first, I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm all these things just like you are. You just have to add elected official to it, and that's where people think they can really pitch at you. But these days were tenuous, and I can remember thinking, and we literally had a couple meetings in the building where we started down the hallway to the meeting room as groups of leaders and didn't get to the meeting. Literally became so contentious before we got in the room that it was a pre-meeting walking down the hall and we didn't make the meeting. And about the second time that happened, Arnie and I stopped in the hallway and just said, "Hey, this is it. We're done. Let's just go back down there and sit down and let's knock some of this stuff out because we got a session to run." And I think once we cleared the noise, if you will,
I agree.
and just said, let's just look at each other and go, how would we do this if we just said it out loud? What would be the parameters? Let's write down some of the rules. Jessica and Angela come in.
Yeah.
They both have vast expertise of legislative
And
process
they've been
and so
studying
on.
every other tie that had happened in the United States. I mean, we talked to all these other states that had done stuff.
Yeah.
And had those kind of issues. And
They
the kind
had
of
case
things they
study
come-
after case study. How do you do this? What did you do? I mean, we had phone calls with people from other states where this kind of thing had happened. And again, you had 100 best friends calling you saying, do this, do this, do this. But we finally got the noise backed off, got to the room, just said, let's make it as fair as possible. And I think that's really
I agree.
the beginning of what turned out to be a pretty remarkable time.
And I think that, I think each of us got to know that others had needs. Example, there's a really nice speaker's house behind, offices behind the dais. The Republicans hadn't been in the speaker's office for a while. It was not as important to me. It was more important to them. It has a functional place. That's where you go to the speaker's house. And I had been in the other office. It was a nice office over in the house. So there were some things I could give up much easier than I could see them giving them up. And I felt really comfortable doing that. And so they gave us the larger caucus room. So we got a bigger room for our group. They got a smaller room for their group. They got an office. We got an office. We finally started getting down to the nitty-gritty things. But if you could get those things solved, then you could start getting into what does each of these things mean. The speaker is in line to be governor depending on ascension into that office. How do we do that? And eventually became, you get the first year, you'll take the second year. Well, I mean, it was kind of like, how can you make it fair?
Yeah.
We made the decision that we changed the gavel every day.
Yeah.
So one person will be the speaker one day, the next person will be the speaker the next day. I mean, how fair can we make it became the mantra between the two of us, and the rest of the people kind of eventually came online.
Well, and I think, a demonstration of that even was, it's your day, it's my day. Hey, I got something going on. I need you to, can you cover
Right.
that? And I don't remember ever
No.
having any issue around that. Just like
No.
you got something going on, you need me to step in, or vice versa, or we needed to trade days. That part we managed through well. And one of the things, because this relates back to what we talked about in terms of who got leadership positions and that, I think we had some of the finest committees that I had ever seen in the legislative process, because we both had the interest of getting our best, most applicable member to the right committee, And you had some committees that in terms of experience and, education for that particular task, they were as good as you could get. I mean, you didn't have to ask these people to do a lot of things. They knew what to do. And you look at the legislative process and you look at the end of the process, and, it's been long enough now, maybe this has all changed, but, we ended the session for us with ending fund balance. Well, that was
Right.
important. We ending the session doing university and school projects, and at somewhat of an unprecedented level. And so things that were important to both of us, we were able to find a way to get to. And when you walked away and looked back, you said, that's because we had the right people in the right place, willing to have conversation.
It was so interesting that how many of them ended up in districts that were next to each other. So here we are in these districts that are next to each other.
Yeah.
Our co-chairs of Ways and Means, our co-chairs, Ashland and Medford.
Yep.
And they were as different as night and day.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
it was
Peter and Dennis.
Peter and Dennis.
Yep.
It was like, wow. But they respected each other in ways that they could have the conversation. We went into the year with no carryover from the previous year, and about a $1.5 billion deficit going into that first year when we were co-speakers. So we had to balance a budget, and whatever you wanted to promise anybody, you couldn't promise anything because there was just no money there. And you have Richardson, who's probably as conservative as any human being I've ever known, saying, we need to keep $500 million.
$500 million. Yep.
We aren't going to spend it. We got to keep that $500 million because you never know how bad it's going to get.
Yeah.
I think we settled for $300 million.
And Buckley wanting to spend it all
All
in
of it,
school.
exactly.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's the perfect example. And we talked about this, we hit on this, but I want to make sure and say it. The other thing we said was, and we'd been through these cycles, remember, where we did this call of the house, call of the house, call of the house. And we had a lead whip on the Republican side, Representative Tim Freeman, who's now a county commissioner. And we had Tobias Reed
Yep.
on the Democratic side. We sat down with these fellows and just said, listen, our leadership style will not allow for a call to the house. So
It's off the table.
that's off the table. You guys, you go figure out how this is going to go. And no matter which one of us is standing at the gavel, we're going to look you in the eyes when we're ready to tap the gavel and take that vote. And the expectation is you'll have everybody at the floor and every vote counted, and we will move this cycle along. We didn't have one.
And we had more than a few times when the Republicans would promise us 6 votes, or we'd promise them 5 votes, or 2 votes, or just 1 vote. I mean, it depended. To get to the 31, we had worked it out with our whips, so that whatever, and you'd stand there waiting because,
Yep.
and you'd go and look and say, we've got ours.
Yeah.
Where are yours?
Yep.
And you see those whips running back to these people, talking to them really seriously, because they had agreed, and they were not going to let it not happen. So,
But the pre-management,
right.
the pre-communication, the clear expectation for here's what we're thinking ought to happen and how it ought to happen, and it should be timely. And frankly, we did that, and
Yep.
we frankly finished the session in a timely manner as
timely,
well.
yep.
So I look back at all of those things, and the uniqueness of the co-speaker model and co-governance model. I think a lot will be said about that over the years, but I think the people that were there really made a lot of that happen, and it was fun to do. And we got to go to Washington D.C.
That's
and
true.
be what was the title? National
Legislative Leaders of the Year.
Yeah,
whatever.
some
Governing
national.
Governing magazine.
Yeah, governing magazine elected us. So we got to do some fun things and
Yeah.
answer a lot of questions about the process.
And I have to say, and Bruce said this before, our 2 leaders in our caucuses are hired people, Jessica and Angela.
Yeah.
Made all the difference in the world. And they got along really, really well.
Yeah.
And so they would smooth things out if it was bubbling up. They'd get together and talk, come back and say, this is kind of what, okay.
Yeah.
And I would say it was oftentimes the hardest conversation was going back to our individual caucuses and say, this is what we've agreed to. And the truth of the matter is, I mean, the thing that made it work, I would take Bruce's word for whatever he said it was. There was no doubt. Once he said, this is what we're going to do, it would take it to the bank. It was over. And he would do whatever it took to get there. And hopefully I felt that he felt the same way with me, because that's the only reason it really worked.
Yeah.
Because once you had to go back to those meetings, you had to make it work.
Well, and I throw in as well, because I do believe that, and that was reciprocated. There was no wondering after you had the conversation and say, here's where we're going, and then get to your caucus and then worry somebody was going to change their mind. But I think we had a unique dialogue. We had unique access to the governor.
That's true.
And because...
And Peter was helpful, actually, in his own way.
Well, and that's the other part of that. The Senate president almost, not exactly, but almost modeled that tie. And
It's true.
they had a one-seat difference, but they had co-chairs of committees. And when you think about how that moves forward, like when we got to the final days, to rules and to
Right.
and to ways and means, it literally meant we were tied. I mean, so the access we had to the governor's office to talk about spending, to talk about what you're going to sign or not sign, I think that was also a very unique time. In my prior years during the legislative cycle, I could tell you, Governor Kulongowski, I probably met 2 or 3 times. I can't tell you how many times we had.
It was amazing.
We had, if it was necessary, I would say daily access
Absolutely true.
to the governor's office and his staff to get through issues. And I think that's because they knew we were going to get to the best decision we could to get both parties to agree. And that added to the uniqueness.
Yep.
Well, there was another change in 2010, which was the ballot measure 71,
Yep.
and changing from a
Playing around to a
yeah,
real one.
yeah, biannual to annual. So talk to me a little bit about that, and if that impacted you.
Well, I think it obviously impacted. I was never a fan of annual session, and I worked relatively hard prior to that. I think what we did that I think finally worked out is we limited the amount of legislation that could be presented by any given member. So I think we did our best to manage it, and I'm only sad to say that when I watched that short session today, it's a free-for-all.
Right.
And so it changed.
We had been having a special session every year. I mean, it was getting ridiculous. And so we had the experiment to do it for a couple of years prior to actually making it happen in that year. So I think we had come to the conclusion that really what the off-year session should be is a budget session. But if you want to have chaos, it's not have committees have committees have nothing to do. Oh my! You have all these people who have nothing to do, festering stuff. So you had to have some policy bills. So limiting them to 1 or 2 bills, putting some deals in that you had to have a co-sponsor that was of the other parties. We did a lot of different kinds of things to kind of make it not quite as crazy with respect to the policy conversations. And if it had been a policy that almost made it through the previous session, that was a good place to start. And I think we all came to the conclusion that having a controlled special session is much better than having a special session called to balance the budget. So we gave it a shot, and I thought we did a pretty good job getting through it.
And I want to be fair to, I say I was not a giant fan, but let me be fair to the people who were huge proponents of it. And you got to think this through, and this gets in the weeds, but if you were a non-Ways and Means member of the legislature and all you saw was a special session for budget, you were sitting there waiting for a floor session and you didn't do anything else while that wait was happening. So to be fair to those members, and I think Arnie touched on it, because if there was no policy committee and it was a special session or a called special session, you really didn't have anything going on. I mean, you got to come and you might have got your per diem, but you didn't. So in fairness to the legislative process and to an elected official, When you made it a regulated special session, now every member had an activity and a vote and a committee to serve on. So that was one of the things. Prior to me being completely a no, I don't want to see us do this. When you think about it from that perspective, it was inclusive. And so there were some things about it that I began to understand from that perspective where otherwise somebody would have been left out, and it brought people
Right.
to the table.
Yep. And it was a practice. You could find out if your idea was worth anything or not. Maybe get it back for the regular session, even if you didn't get it through in that session.
Yeah.
So it served its purpose. We didn't have any special sessions going on while this
Yeah.
was happening. And this had been a very tumultuous time just before, with a big recession, a whole bunch of other kinds of stuff. We were getting money back. We didn't know how much we were going to have, what we're going to do. So having a chance to fine tune it, I think made sense at the time.
What do you think were some of the biggest accomplishments of the 76th Oregon legislative session?
For me, there were two really big ones, and one was balancing a budget. I didn't know how we were going to balance the budget. I mean, that was first in mind for me the whole time, and I had not been on Ways and Means as much prior to this. Been involved in a little bit of it, but not as involved as you get when you're one of the co-speakers. So that one weighed on my mind a lot. I spent a lot of time thinking about it and figuring out how to do that, and talking with Buckley and trying to have a conversation with Mr. Richardson about different things that he believes strongly in. And the other one was redistricting, which had not been done in the building legislatively for
Yeah.
a long time. It had been the Secretary of State who'd finally drawn in the lines the last couple times before that. So I think that was important for us. We really wanted it to happen. Didn't know if it would, but we put really good people in there, and they made it work. So I give a lot of credit for that.
I think both of those two are incredibly important, and probably the greatest one to me lives on, and that is, I don't see people that have been involved in the legislative process, whether it's from the budget side of the process to policy people to lobbyists, all those folks. If you and I walked down the street and we saw them today, those people would walk up and say, "Thank you, that was the greatest session we've ever." So I'm going to say this, and I don't mean it to sound self-serving, but I grant credit to everybody there, and I think it gave the people of Oregon a glimpse and a bit of hope that government can work the way it's intended to. And I think when you see people and they are the type that have paid attention, they go back to that cycle and say, yeah, nobody got really mad and nobody got really sad. Nobody got exactly what they wanted, but nobody got really hosed.
Right.
And when you think about that, and frankly, we moved healthcare.
We did.
We moved healthcare a long ways down the road with
Tim Freeman was a biggie in that.
yeah, with the hospital.
And Tina Kotek.
Yeah, those two people. So, you know, there's some things that you could say maybe would have never happened, except in a cycle like we had. So,
I
pretty
would
proud
never
of
have gone to Dorchester.
Yeah.
He invited me to go, so
Yeah.
I went. We had a conversation at Dorchester.
Yeah.
Very felt like a deal.
Yeah.
And we did a couple town halls in our neutral districts
Yeah.
together. So
Which
that
were
was kinda-
fun.
It was
Yeah.
really nice.
Yeah.
I think that was good for our
Yeah.
district people to see two people working together that way.
Yeah. I
That's
think it
kinda
built
nice.
faith among Oregonians that
Yep.
it could happen the right way.
So that leads to my next question, which is, talk to me about the importance of bipartisan cooperation in 2024.
Yeah. It's interesting to have watched over the last 10 years or however
Yeah.
many, about 10 years. It's interesting to have watched. You know, in the early years when you were first gone, you personally knew the people, right? So you're thinking to yourself, all right, get it together, you know. And even for me, I knew you and you'd move over to the Senate. And I'm
Right.
like, cool. You know, Arnie's going to take that experience and that leadership and that's going to translate over. And it's also an interesting, as soon as you leave the legislature, you know, you're either in it or you're out of it. And
true.
you know, somebody told me this one time, you know, you got 1,000 friends when you're in the legislature And the only friends you have the day after you leave are the ones you had before you
Before you
left.
left.
So, and I think that's very true. But you can't get it out of your veins. You still watch, you still listen, you still talk to the people that you know are closely connected to it. And my hope is that you could get back to that decorum, which just says, even when we disagree, we can be professional and polite. And my greatest disappointment is, and I think this happens among electeds, and it also happens among the public, they just feel like they can throw any name they want at an elected because they have an issue difference with them. And among the electeds, they want to throw those names back and forth at each other just because they have an issue or two, and they forget to go back to the basics of, that's just a mom or sister sitting across from you, or that could be your brother, or, you forget that they're people and they have feelings, and they, as Arnie described, they all came for probably the right reason. And so to get back to that partisan-based conversation, figure out what the differences are, figure out what the things are that could meld some ideas together. I'd like to see us get a little better at that again.
I enjoyed my Senate 8 years. I spent a lot of time working with Republican friends. We have a coastal caucus, which is made up of the coastal legislatures. And at the time, it was about half and half, Democrats and Republicans. But there were 8 of us, so it was enough that we could sway just about any vote. If we decided as a group we weren't going to go that way, it wasn't going to go that way. And if we decided it was going to go that way, it probably would go that way, because you'd have enough Republicans. And we started using that as an influence to work with different people. Courtney gave me lots of opportunities with mental health care, with education, Student Success Act. I got a lot of opportunities to work in a bipartisan way that we had forced over in the House to get things through. And some of the votes didn't come out as bipartisan, but the work by the Republicans and the Democrats was really bipartisan. The Student Success Act, all of those people went all over the state. They came back. I think everybody liked the policy. The Republicans did not particularly like the funding source, but that was a conversation that was happening separately, but it was interesting to see all that stuff happen. So the last big committee they put me on as the co-chair of the coronavirus committee. So it had just started happening in 20. And so we had Democrats and Republicans, and again, it was working together to try to figure out what we could do to get the state, in much as we could, get ready. That's when I started growing a beard for the first time. So that was my coronavirus attempt.
Yeah.
It was, I wish we could get back. I think now I would say to you that the federal stuff has leaked down into the state. And that is frustrating to me, because some of these people who I hear them say the things they say, I know them, and they don't, I just don't understand how they're saying that, because they wouldn't have done that 5 years ago, 8 years ago. So those things have changed in a way that is frustrating. I think our state is, even after redistricting, the next year we were in the majority again. So there was one time when the Republicans, I know that for me being in the minority was a good experience in understanding governance and what I needed to learn and what I needed to do to try to get to the next place. When you get too long with the same group and you get to supermajorities and then even bigger majorities, so you don't even need people to show up, those are frightening to me. And I was always on the edge with respect to all my Democratic progressive people, because I was really about the labor worker guy. I mean, that was I'm a 1950s Democrat. So, and sometimes we forget those people, and that makes me upset. And then we forget them on both sides, and they just get run over by government. So it's trying to figure out how do we have those conversations going, because I agree, it starts with collegiality and doing stuff together. If there's one bill way back, which I got to help talk about, it was some of the ethics stuff. It used to be the lobby would bring all of the freshmen together for a big time, Democrats and Republicans, and you'd have these conversations. I think some of those things were really helpful. They've mostly gone away now because you can't take more than $50. So how do you build back respect for each other How do you build back an understanding of each other where you've actually sat down and had a meal together and talked about what drove you to get to here and why are you here? And because you'll find you have a whole lot more in common than you have that is not in common. We don't do that as much as we used to, and I feel bad about that. And I
Well,
think that's
we've
what-
created some rules,
That's
as
true.
you say, because in our freshman cycle, I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it was the pizza party kind of
Yes,
thing.
that's right, yeah.
And all of us, and that's where I met every person.
Yeah, that's right.
I met Paul Holvey there, I met
That's
you
right.
there, I met
That's
Betty
right.
Comp there,
That's right.
I mean, if you think about it, that was it, and you did stand around and kind of got to know people.
That's right.
And then when all the rules came about, well, you can't do this, and you can't have a meal together, and you can't accept this, that was really a divider.
Yep.
I mean, it separated people, and then you only did it individually instead
Or
of as
with
a
your
group.
caucus.
Yeah, or with your caucus, and then
Yep.
it was you quit building, some cross friendships and so on, and it got to the point where the only time you talked to somebody on the other side was sitting on the floor.
That's true.
Betty Comp and I were friends because we sat next to each other.
Yep.
I mean, it's just how that is, but the rule-making process itself, inadvertently, I think, because I think the idea
Right.
was, hey,
Correct.
we don't want people getting bought off, and, okay, we all agree to that, but to spend a meal together seemed like the right thing to do because you built relationships with people.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned working as a senator, so my final question is just tell me some of the differences or similarities between working for both houses.
You get used to using the rules that are in the House, and you go over to the Senate and you think they would be the same. And then you find out they're not. It's really strange. So it took me a while to figure that out. Again, getting to know the clerks and people and asking them questions is really helpful. But when we had a bill come out of a committee, you had like 3 days and it was on the floor. It was going to the floor. It came out of a committee, it goes to the floor. That's a rule. In the Senate, it comes out of a committee, it goes to the Senate President. Oh. If he doesn't want to put it on the floor, he never puts it on the floor. I mean, he had total control. The Senate President has a lot more control than the speakers have with respect to how to manage the floor and make things happen. That was a big shocker to me. I ended up on more than a few meetings with people, with the Senate President and other people who wanted their bill, and anyway, and those got contentious, but the reality is, for whatever reasons, the Senate President has some different tools that were not available in the House with respect to managing what was happening on the floor. There were a few other things. I think the idea of decorum, there's only 30 of you, so it's a lot less raucous or whatever. I mean, that seems to have changed a little bit over the last few sessions, but I think there was a deep respect for each other at the time I was there, which I really appreciated. There were a couple other people who I got along really, really well with, so the president would say, could you go sit down with this group of people and have a conversation and see if you can figure out where we can go from here. Suction dredge mining, a whole bunch of other different things that I got involved with that got to be contentious, but we were able to work out some things that didn't affect everybody, because some of the maps that first came out, you weren't going to be able to do anything anywhere in the state, which is kind of ridiculous. And so figuring out how to work with people that I learned in the House was helpful in the Senate, but it was never quite the same over there. And I was always in the majority when I was over there, sometimes supermajority, so it was kind of a interesting time. So the fights were always with the moderates in the Democratic Party if we were going to go someplace. The Betsy Johnsons and myself and a few others. And there were times when it didn't matter what we wanted to do either, because it wasn't going to change anything. So those were some of the little differences that happened. But other than that, the process is pretty much the same. Write the bill, get it into a committee, have a conversation, figure out how to go from the next step and do the things. So it's pretty much the same. Counting votes, singular important thing, especially when we're in the House and the Senate, having a good whip that knows how to count votes. We didn't do that in the Senate as much as we did in the House. In the House, as a whip, I talked to every single person, and I was trained by somebody in the governor's office that said, look them in the eye, ask them how they're going to vote. If they say, I think I'm going to vote this way, you say, okay, I'll come back to you. Well, no, I told you what I was going to do. No, you didn't. You told me you think you're going to vote for it. Until I get you to say, I will vote for it,
Yeah.
I can't, I have to believe you're a no.
Yeah.
What? I said, it's the way it is. Look me in the eyes, tell me you're gonna vote for it, I accept it. Otherwise, it's not. In the Senate, we would have caucus meetings and we'd ask people what they want, how they're gonna go. And they would use that. And I always thought, it's really not as secure. I did not feel as comfortable with that, but that's the way they did. So they did a lot of those kinds of things much differently. So it's just style and other kinds of things, but, and a few rule differences.
What years were you in the Senate?
So I left in 2012, so I was 13 through 2021 actually I left.
And then when did your time in the House end?
I was there from '04 to 14.
Okay. Was it hard to go the next session when you weren't both co-speakers of the House, to going back and?
Well, it was for me because I went back in the minority, and so, you know,
And Tina.
and yeah, and a completely different leadership.
Tina was right after?
Tina followed me, actually. She, in our caucus, we had a vote at the end of the regular session to see who would be the leader of the caucus. And Dave had been the leader, and then Tina beat him in the middle of the term. So she became the leader of the second half and then became the speaker.
Yeah. And so my final cycle, I still got to serve in Ways and Means and so forth, but your schedule becomes much less busy. I had made a decision a long time ago that 5 terms was going to be it for me. I didn't have a interest in staying longer. I had a business to come home to and run, and I had grandkids and a wife that I wanted to be with and a lot of other things. And so, you know, you hear the term lame duck member or however you want to say. You've been in that leadership role. I'd been in caucus leadership. I'd been in the speaker's office with Arnie, and then you go to being a member. So it's a drastically different process, but I will say this, you know, the caucus leader that cycle elected was Mike McLean. You're able to mentor and talk your way through. You're able to, all the experience you have had legislatively, you can help somebody a great deal without having your name to any part of it. But you sort of become the go-to in terms of how do you do this and how do you do that and how does this happen? Okay, you know, so I count that as pretty special time to transition to another group of leaders. And listen, I'm as grateful for Arnie going on and serving in the Senate. I'm grateful to every member who will give up their time and go, you know, act in those positions of elected leadership, because in one way or another, you're giving something up to be there. So I'm grateful to all of them today, and I'm grateful for all of them then.
Those are the questions I have. Is there anything else that y'all wanted to make sure we covered?
I just count it as I count it as you know, one of our greatest times of life, honestly. It was very special. You can't imagine, and I said this, but the breadth of material you cover, the number of people you meet, the perspective brought to you about every topic, whether you agree with it or not. People put a lot of thought in things they're going to say to you. And it will open your eyes, and it's a fabulous experience.
It's a lot like graduate school, because there are so many things you didn't necessarily know you needed to know about, and all of a sudden you're presented with them. And then you have to know enough about it to really make a decision. So all of a sudden you're just studying all the time at different aspects of whatever. For me, it solidified how well government can work. I think our session was pretty amazing as well. And it solidified the fact that I really wanted to continue to do that kind of stuff. So as soon as I got out of the legislature, I ran for my school board, so I'm on my school board. I'm going to be on the foundation board. I've been on the state fair board since the inception of the state fair, the way it's run now, and I've enjoyed all of those things. And I get to work with some of the people. Cameron, county commissioner, came on on the fair board. So I've had the opportunity to work with some of the people that we made friendships way back then in different roles. I just think public services, for me, has been the choice that I've made in life that I really love to do. So I don't see myself ever not doing something.
Well, I appreciate both of you talking with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
It has been. It's great to spend some time with